All right, I think we're about to get started here if you all want to settle in. All right, well, welcome, and thank you all for coming out tonight to our second event for MBTA Community Zoning. My name is Valerie Ortiz. I am the planning director. I'm here with Michael Slagle, who is our land use planner. I'm also seeing some members of the planning board here, if you want to just raise your hand to identify yourselves. Thank you. We also have members of the Open Space Committee, if you want to say hi too. Thank you all so much for being here. It's fantastic. So let's get into the agenda. The first portion of tonight will be presenting some of the basics around 3A and MBTA communities. We'll review Stow's requirements and take a look at the amount of land that's needed for our district. And then we'll share some of our preliminary mapping. And after that, we'll dive into a small group activity, which will be asking you to let us know where you think the most suitable place in Stow is for multifamily housing. And then after that, we're going to come back together as a group, kind of share out what we all talked about, and then we'll conclude. So to get started, MBTA communities, or Section 3A, was approved in 2021. So this sets requirements for 177 towns in the state to create a multifamily district that allows that kind of housing by right. So no special permits, no zoning waivers, no discretionary zoning approvals. And these communities are divided based on their location into rapid transit communities, commuter rail, adjacent communities, and adjacent small towns, which Stow is one of. So Stow, as an adjacent small town, got that designation because of our population, our proximity to the South Acton commuter rail station, and also the population density here. So in a moment, I'll describe what our minimum requirements are. But the zoning must allow for a density of 15 units per acre. We can't place any age restrictions on the zoning district, and we also can't put any additional restrictions on it. It can be an overlay district or an underlying district, but it must be of a reasonable size, and I'll talk about that in a moment too. So we're able to require up to 10% of the units to be deed restricted to affordable purchasers or renters, and we have an option for increased affordability through a mechanism that the state put in place, so that's an option for us. If there is a developer coming forward to construct one of these developments, they will have to abide by the Wetlands Protection Act and by Title V. And again, we can't impose stricter standards than we typically already have in place for a residential district. So we can't get into design guidelines or higher energy standards. So why did the state create this requirement? So we know that to grow and maintain a healthy regional economy, we need more people. So in Massachusetts, every single town has been underproducing housing, and this has gone on for so long that it's led to this housing shortage that we're in. And when we have a less supply of housing, it's driving housing prices up. And so even in Stow, we're seeing the effects of this. Since 2016, our median housing price has increased by 50%. So even locally, we're getting that pressure. And some benefits of the new law. With some thoughtful planning, Stow can definitely see a lot of these benefits. So zoning to allow new types of housing simply provides more opportunities so that older adults can age within the community that they know and love. Grandparents can stay close to their grandchildren. Younger couples, college graduates can all come back to the community that they know. And it's also a particular benefit for our local businesses. Perhaps we could have customers that are in walking distance to their shops. Perhaps we're also providing housing for future employees, someone who could live on a retail salary. So I won't get into what multifamily housing looks like too much. In the coming months, we're going to be looking more at our specific zoning language. So we'll get into design in the future, but I do want to offer just a quick definition of multifamily housing. So the state is defining it as one building with more than 3 units within it, so like a triplex, or multiple buildings on the same parcel that each have at least 2 units of housing in it. So there's lots of different types of housing. So this is modest, gentle density housing options. So in Stow, we have a minimum unit capacity of 139 units. So again, we don't have a specific location requirement, but it does need to be developable, and Michael will talk in a little bit about what developable means. So in order to create the zoning for 15 units an acre to get 139 units, we're going to be looking for a zoning district of about 9.3 acres. And just for the purpose of this discussion, we're going to round that up to an even 10. So tonight we'll be talking a lot about where to site at least, so a minimum of a 10-acre district, but we can also look at dividing this up into smaller portions. So we can have as small as a 5-acre portion. So we can say 2 5-acre portions, 1 10-acre portion, or of course we can always increase this. And then the deadline to comply for the zoning bylaw is the end of next year. So we have a little more time. So before we dive into our preliminary mapping analysis, I just want to help visualize, what 10 acres looks like. So I'm going to go through a few different parcels, and please know that I'm not recommending these parcels, simply kind of pointing out some landmarks in Stow that are maybe familiar to you all or can kind of give a sense of what we're talking about. So we'll start big. We'll start with the whole town. So we have 11,500 acres in town. So 10 acres is 0.1%, less than 0.1% of our total land area. If we get a little smaller, look at town forest, it's roughly 370 acres, so 10 acres would be 2.7% of town forest. Getting smaller, if you're familiar with Lake Boone, that's 163 acres, so 10 acres would be just over 6% of the total of Lake Boone. Now getting a little bit smaller, if you're familiar with Stow Community Park, the ball fields, the tennis courts, and the parking lot are all about 8.3 acres. So we would need a little bit more than what you typically use of Stow Community Park. And if you're familiar with Center School, so it's the building itself and the land in front of the school, the parking lot, the playground, a little bit of green space, that is all 7.8 acres. So again, we need more than that for the 10-acre, less for the 5. Memorial Field at Town Forest is 5 acres. It includes the ball fields, but also a little bit of the surrounding woodland. And the Gleasondale Mill parcel is just under 5 acres. All right, so I'll pass it to Michael to talk more about what we've done so far with our mapping analysis.
All right, thank you, Valerie. So I will take you through the process that we did for our preliminary mapping analysis, and then we'll do a small mapping activity in our groups. So this slide here is an overview of the process that we did for creating our mapping analysis. We have a lot of different criteria that we need to funnel down to refine where this district should go. So there are 2 main areas right now that we've considered for how we're going to site our district. The first being the requirements from the state, and then some of the preferences from the planning board. So those kind of got filtered through and gave us areas in town that we're able to consider for our MBTA community's zoning district. So from the state's perspective, they gave us a list of excluded land. So this is land that we are not able to include within our zoning district because it won't count. If we want to include it, we just would not get the credit for it. So the state has a long list of excluded land, such as water bodies, protected open spaces, public land, wellhead protection areas for drinking water supplies, institutional land, such as land for private schools or other nonprofits, and publicly owned land that is not deemed as developable. So they gave us that big list, but they also gave us a list of what land we can develop. And that includes all privately owned land and specific types of publicly owned land, such as land owned by a housing authority, identified in the housing production plan that the town has, or other land that is intended to be developed into housing. So mapping this out, you can see that this map has a lot of different colors for the excluded land. This data was provided to us by the state, and it's intended to provide an overview of where we should not put our district. The areas that are in white are the areas that we could develop or we could consider for our MBTA district. So you can see that there are areas all scattered throughout town that are excluded, but there's also areas all around town that we could zone for our district. We took this a step further and said there's probably land that the state didn't consider that might be excluded if we were to consider it. And those are majority of the parcels that have been recently developed or are currently under permitting. So we have Stow Acres, the cottages at Wandering Pond, and we also have some developed condo sites like Regency at Stow, Villages at Stow, and Meeting House. So these land, from an initial standpoint, might be able to pass as a compliant zoning district, but they likely won't be due to some of the other towns that have tried doing similar things. The state also gave us what they're calling sensitive land, and this is land that is primarily located within the Wellhead Protection Zone 2s. A lot of these areas are caused by other municipalities' water supply areas that are kind of bleeding into Stow, and you can see those in that dark red color. And then the state also just says to be careful if you want to develop within agricultural land. They gave us a few parcels, but it isn't a complete list based on the local knowledge that we have. So sensitive land could be included within our MBTA district, but we just want to make sure that if there are other suitable places, we prioritize those first before going into the sensitive land. Next is the list of the planning board's criteria. We have spoken with the planning board and developed this list of what the planning board wants to consider for areas suitable or not suitable for a district. So starting at the top, the planning board would want a district to be located near businesses, services, and jobs. They would also want it near schools and municipal services and pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure. We also talked about having it close to the South Acton train station to kind of fit the spirit of the MBTA community's legislation, and as an alternative way for people to commute to their jobs. The board also wants to protect and preserve some of our existing farms, agriculture, and open space, preserve historic buildings, and preserve historic and rural views of town. And one last criteria that the board would want to consider is the trailheads, parks, and other recreation spaces throughout town, making sure that new residents would have access to some of those great resources that we have. So here it is mapped out based on the planning board's criteria. So in this basic analysis, you can see that the parcels that contain these resources have a big buffer of about a quarter mile each from them. So you'll see all these different blobs, and they represent areas that the planning board would want a compliant district. And then on the next slide, we have areas that the planning board would want to avoid. These ones are in that reddish color, and you can see they're also scattered throughout town. When we put this together with the state's requirements, we have this in kind of a gradient form. So the parcels on the left map have a darker blue. Those ones are more ideal in the planning board's perspective for having a compliant MBTA district. And then on the right, you can see the darker red color is areas where the planning board would want to avoid. So this preliminary analysis just goes over the planning board and the state's idea of where we can have our district. And Valerie will introduce our mapping activity so that you can provide your input on where you think a district should go.
All right. So in your small groups, you're going to be tasked with showing us where you'd want the district. So Michael's passing out an instruction sheet, some more ideas about visualizing density, and then pens, stickers, Post-it notes. Please feel free to use whatever means you want to express where you want this district or where you do not want this district. So if you have more thoughts about where you'd want us to avoid, that's perfectly helpful. Please let us know that. I'll also say that the stickers are in two different sizes. So you'll see there's a smaller sticker that's scaled to 5 acres. And on the roll is a larger sticker that is scaled to 10 acres. So you have your 5 and your 10. Feel free to overlap, mix and match, mark up those maps. And at the end, please select a member to represent your group. We're going to ask you a couple of questions as you come back. So wanting to know a little bit more about how this process worked for you. So you'll have about 25 minutes. Have at it.